October 1944. The Belgian lowlands near the Scheldt estuary. It is 2 hours past midnight. The temperature hovers just above freezing. A thin rain falls sideways, carried by North Sea winds that cut through wool and leather alike. In the darkness, a convoy of trucks idles on a cratered road. Their headlights are blacked out. Their engines rumble low, waiting. Ahead, where a bridge once stood, there is only a gap, twisted iron, shattered stone. The Germans blew it 3 days ago during their retreat, but in that gap, men are working. Canadian sappers from the Royal Canadian Engineers move in disciplined silence. They haul steel panels through knee-deep mud. They hammer pins into prefabricated frames. Their hands are raw, their boots are soaked through. No one complains. By dawn, a Bailey bridge stretches across the void. 120 feet of portable steel, assembled in 7 hours under artillery threat. The convoy rolls forward. Ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, food. The infantry will never know their names. The tanks will never slow to ask who built the road beneath their treads. But without these men, and thousands like them, the liberation of Europe would have ground to a halt in the autumn mud. This is the story of how Canadians turned impossible terrain into open highways, how they built the invisible backbone of Allied victory. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces had achieved what many thought impossible. On June 6th, the largest amphibious invasion in history landed on the beaches of Normandy. Within weeks, over 1 million soldiers, more than 170,000 vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies had crossed the English Channel. But victory on the beaches was only the beginning. The breakout from Normandy in late July sent Allied forces surging across France at a pace that stunned even the most optimistic planners. General George Patton's Third Army raced eastward. British and Canadian forces pushed north toward Belgium and the Netherlands. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. It looked, for a brief moment, like the war might end by Christmas. Then the machine began to stall. The problem was not the enemy. German forces were in disarray, retreating faster than they could reorganize. The problem was distance. Every mile the Allies advanced stretched their supply lines thinner. Every liberated town meant more roads to repair, more bridges to rebuild, more infrastructure to restore. The Normandy beaches, the only functioning Allied supply ports, were now over 400 miles behind the front lines. Trucks burned through fuel just to deliver fuel. Ammunition convoys arrived days late. Tanks sat idle, waiting for spare parts that never came. This was the logistics crisis of autumn 1944, and it threatened to undo everything the Allies had gained. What the Allies needed was a deep-water port, a functioning harbour close to the front, a way to bypass the impossible distance between Normandy and the Rhine. That port was Antwerp. Antwerp was the largest port in Europe. Its docks could handle more cargo than all the Normandy beaches combined. British forces captured the city on September 4, 1944. Remarkably intact, its harbour facilities largely undamaged. But there was a problem. Antwerp sits 50 miles inland, connected to the sea by the Scheldt estuary, a wide, marshy waterway controlled entirely by German forces. The port was useless as long as the enemy held both banks of the river. Ships could not reach the docks. Supplies could not flow. The task of clearing the Scheldt fell to the 1st Canadian Army. It was, by any measure, one of the most difficult assignments of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The terrain was a nightmare. Flooded polders, dike roads, waterlogged fields that swallowed vehicles whole. The Germans had prepared extensive defences. They had flooded vast areas deliberately, turning the landscape into a shallow inland sea. And every bridge, every causeway, every road junction had been rigged with demolitions. This was not a campaign that would be won by tanks alone. It would be won by engineers, by the men who could rebuild what the enemy destroyed, by the soldiers who could turn mud into a highway and wreckage into a crossing. The Royal Canadian Engineers, supported by field companies, road construction units and bridging teams, would become the unsung architects of this victory. They came from every province. Miners from British Columbia, loggers from Ontario, farmers from the prairies who knew how to work soil and timber. They had trained in England for years, practicing the assembly of Bailey bridges, the grading of roads, the construction of airfields. Now, in the flooded lowlands of Belgium and the Netherlands, they would put that training to the ultimate test. The liberation of Europe would not wait for perfect conditions. It would be built, one bridge, one road, one timber crossing at a time, through the worst terrain the war had yet offered. The landscape itself was the first enemy. The Scheldt region had been farmland once, flat, fertile, protected by centuries-old dike systems. But the Germans had breached those dikes. Seawater poured inland. Fields became lakes. Roads became rivers. The few remaining causeways turned into deadly choke points, swept by artillery and machine gun fire. Canadian engineers faced a puzzle with no easy solution. Standard bridging equipment was designed for rivers, not for flooded plains stretching hundreds of meters wide. Vehicles sank in mud so deep that recovery teams needed hours to extract them. Timber had to be hauled from distant forests. Steel had to be transported over roads that barely existed. Every solution created new problems. Every crossing required improvisation. Yet the work continued, night after night, day after day. The engineers adapted. They invented. They found ways to make the impossible merely difficult. These men were not frontline infantry. They did not charge enemy positions with rifles raised. But they died just the same. Sapper crews worked within range of German artillery. Mortar rounds fell without warning. Snipers targeted anyone who moved in daylight. And the work itself was dangerous. Heavy steel panels, unstable ground, exhaustion-induced mistakes. Many engineers went days without sleep. They worked through shelling. They worked through rain. They worked through the constant, grinding awareness that the men behind them, the infantry, the armor, the entire advance, depended on what they built. There were no medals for most of them, no headlines, just the quiet knowledge that every bridge they completed carried the war one step closer to ending. Generals study maps. They draw arrows. They speak of thrusts and flanking maneuvers. But every arrow on a map requires a road. Every thrust requires fuel. Every maneuver requires a bridge that can bear the weight of a Sherman tank. 33 tons of steel and momentum. The Canadian engineers understood this better than anyone. They knew that a single destroyed crossing could halt an entire division. They knew that a cratered road could delay an attack by hours. Hours that cost lives. Their work was not glamorous, but it was essential. Without functioning supply lines, the most brilliant strategy was worthless. Without bridges, the most powerful army was stranded. The engineers gave the generals their arrows. They turned plans into possibilities. Commanding an engineering unit in combat required a different kind of leadership. These officers could not simply order a charge. They had to calculate load capacities, estimate construction times, allocate scarce resources across competing demands. Brigadier Geoffrey Walsh, commanding the Royal Canadian Engineers in northwest Europe, faced impossible choices daily. Which bridge to prioritize? Which road to repair first? Where to position his limited bridging equipment for maximum effect? The decisions were technical, but the stakes were human. A wrong choice meant delayed supplies. Delayed supplies meant men dying for lack of ammunition or medical care. Walsh and his officers learned to think like logisticians and act like soldiers. They balanced engineering precision with battlefield urgency, and they trusted their men to execute under conditions that would break lesser units. The retreating Wehrmacht understood the value of infrastructure. They destroyed it systematically. Every bridge was blown. Every culvert was cratered. Roads were mined. Railway lines were twisted into unusable tangles. In some areas, German engineers had spent weeks preparing demolitions, ensuring that nothing usable remained. This was not random destruction. It was calculated delay. Every hour the Allies spent rebuilding was an hour the Germans used to regroup, to dig new defences, to prepare the next line of resistance. The Canadian engineers found themselves in a grim race, rebuilding faster than the enemy could destroy. It was exhausting, frustrating, and absolutely critical. Necessity breeds invention, and in the mud of the Scheldt, Canadian engineers invented constantly. They modified Bailey Bridge designs to span wider gaps. They developed corduroy roads, logs laid side by side to cross ground too soft for conventional surfaces. They used captured German equipment when their own ran short. They improvised pontoon crossings from whatever materials they could find. One unit famously constructed a bridge using parts from 3 different Allied designs, assembled in a configuration that existed in no manual. It held. The tanks crossed. The advance continued. This adaptability, this willingness to solve problems on the spot without waiting for official approval, became a hallmark of Canadian engineering in the campaign. The next challenge would test that adaptability to its absolute limit. By mid-October 1944, the battle for the Scheldt estuary had reached its most desperate phase. The 1st Canadian Army was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. To the north, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division struggled to clear the South Beveland Peninsula, a narrow strip of land connected to the mainland by a single causeway. To the south, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division pushed through the flooded Breskens Pocket, where German paratroopers defended every dike and farmhouse with fanatic determination. And everywhere, the engineers followed. The causeway to South Beveland was a killing ground, barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. It stretched for over a mile across flooded polders. German artillery had it zeroed. Machine guns covered every approach. The infantry who crossed it did so under constant fire, crawling forward through the night. When they reached the other side, they found the bridges destroyed. Every single one. The call went out to the Royal Canadian Engineers. Bridging teams moved forward under cover of darkness, their trucks loaded with Bailey Bridge components. They worked in water up to their waists. They worked while shells exploded in the flooded fields around them. They worked knowing that dawn would bring renewed German fire. By morning, the first bridge was complete. Tanks rolled across. The advance resumed. But South Beveland was only the beginning. Beyond it lay Walcheren Island, the final obstacle controlling the Scheldt. Walcheren was a fortress. Its coastline bristled with heavy gun batteries. Its interior had been deliberately flooded by the RAF, which had bombed the dikes to deny the Germans defensive terrain. The result was a nightmare. The island's centre was an inland sea. The only dry ground was the rim, a narrow ring of dunes and fortifications. Canadian and British forces would assault Walcheren from multiple directions in early November. But every assault required crossings. Every crossing required engineers. The assault on Walcheren began on November 1st, 1944. British commandos landed on the western beaches at Westkapelle, fighting through concrete bunkers and flooded streets. From the south, Canadian forces crossed the Slow Channel, a tidal waterway separating South Beveland from Walcheren, in Buffalo amphibious vehicles, under murderous German fire. Every inch of progress created new engineering demands. The slow crossing was treacherous. The channel was shallow in places, deep in others, with a bottom of sucking mud that trapped vehicles and men alike. Canadian engineers worked alongside the assault troops, marking safe routes, recovering stuck vehicles, preparing the ground for the heavier equipment that would follow. On the island itself, the flooded interior made conventional movement impossible. Troops advanced along dike tops, exposed, vulnerable, but the only dry ground available. When bridges were needed, they had to be built on unstable, waterlogged foundations. When roads were needed, they had to be constructed from whatever materials could be salvaged from ruined Dutch farms. By November 8th, Walcheren was secured. The guns that had controlled the Scheldt were silenced, but the work was far from over. The port of Antwerp remained unusable. German forces had sown the estuary with thousands of mines. Contact mines, magnetic mines, acoustic mines, pressure mines. The approaches were a labyrinth of hidden death. Before a single supply ship could reach the docks, every mine had to be found and destroyed. This task fell to Royal Navy minesweepers, supported by Canadian naval personnel. It was painstaking, dangerous work. The sweepers moved slowly, methodically, clearing lanes through the minefields while German long-range artillery continued to harass them from positions further inland. Meanwhile, Canadian engineers turned their attention to the port facilities themselves. Though the docks had survived largely intact, the surrounding infrastructure had not. Rail lines were severed. Roads were cratered. Warehouses had been looted or damaged. The entire system needed restoration before full-scale operations could begin. Working around the clock, Engineering units repaired railway connections, rebuilt road networks, and restored electrical systems. They coordinated with British and American logistics teams, creating a unified supply chain that could handle the massive flow of material the Allied armies required. On November 28, 1944, nearly 3 months after the capture of Antwerp's city centre, the first Allied convoy entered the port. The ships carried ammunition, fuel, food, and medical supplies. They carried the lifeblood of the Allied advance, and they arrived because Canadian soldiers had cleared the estuary. Canadian engineers had rebuilt the infrastructure, and Canadian determination had refused to accept the impossible. The supply crisis was over. The road to Germany was open. The numbers tell part of the story. During the Northwest Europe campaign, Canadian engineering units constructed over 130 major bridges. They built or repaired more than 2,500 miles of roads. They cleared thousands of mines, filled countless craters, and restored dozens of railway lines. In the Scheldt campaign alone, the Royal Canadian Engineers built Bailey bridges totaling more than 3,000 feet in combined length, nearly a kilometre of portable steel, assembled under fire in some of the worst terrain the war had offered. These were not abstract statistics. Each bridge represented hours of back-breaking labour. Each road represented men working through exhaustion, through shelling, through conditions that would defeat lesser units. The human cost was real. Engineering units suffered casualties throughout the campaign. Sappers killed by mines they were clearing. Bridging teams struck by artillery. Construction crews caught in ambushes. The exact numbers are difficult to isolate, scattered across unit war diaries and casualty reports. But the sacrifice was constant. Beyond the physical construction, Canadian engineers performed countless smaller tasks that kept the army moving. They maintained water supply points. They built and repaired airfields. They constructed prisoner-of-war enclosures. They demolished obstacles and booby traps left behind by retreating German forces. Every task was essential. Every task was unglamorous. And every task was performed by men who understood that the infantry and armour ahead of them depended on the work they did behind. The opening of Antwerp transformed Allied logistics overnight. Within weeks, the port was handling over 25,000 tons of supplies daily, more than all the Normandy beaches combined at their peak. The desperate fuel shortages of September became a memory. The ammunition rationing that had crippled offensive operations was lifted. The Allied armies could move again, and they could move because Canadian engineers had given them the roads and bridges to do so. The strategic consequences extended far beyond the immediate campaign. With Antwerp operational, the Allies could sustain the massive build-up required for the final push into Germany. The Rhine crossings of early 1945, Operations Veritable, Plunder, and Varsity, depended entirely on the supply lines that flowed through the Scheldt. Canadian engineers played central roles in those operations as well. The crossing of the Rhine in March 1945 required bridging on a scale never before attempted. Within days of the first assault crossings, engineers had constructed bridges capable of carrying the heaviest Allied tanks. The advance into the German heartland accelerated. But the impact was not only military. The restoration of infrastructure brought relief to millions of Dutch and Belgian civilians who had endured years of occupation. Roads meant food deliveries. Bridges meant reconnection with isolated communities. Functioning railways meant the return of something approaching normal life. Dutch civilians, starving after the hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, watched Canadian supply trucks roll through their villages. They saw roads rebuilt, utilities restored, the physical fabric of their society mended by men in khaki uniforms who asked nothing in return. This was liberation in its most practical form. Not just the departure of German soldiers, but the arrival of functioning systems, roads that worked, bridges that held, infrastructure that served the living rather than the machinery of occupation. The gratitude was deep and lasting. In towns across the Netherlands, Canadian engineers were welcomed as heroes, not for dramatic battlefield victories, but for the quieter heroism of reconstruction. They had taken a shattered landscape and made it whole again. Decades later, Dutch families would still remember the Canadians who rebuilt their bridges. They would name streets after engineering units, They would tend the graves of sappers who never made it home. The memory of liberation was inseparable from the memory of reconstruction. History remembers the generals. It remembers the great offensives, the decisive battles, the moments when the tide of war visibly turned. It less often remembers the men who made those moments possible. The Canadian engineers who served in Northwest Europe never sought glory. They understood their role: essential, invisible, indispensable. They built the roads that carried the ammunition. They constructed the bridges that bore the tanks. They restored the ports that fed the advance. Without them, the liberation of Europe would have stalled in the autumn mud of 1944. Without them, the Allied armies would have outrun their supplies and ground to a halt. Without them, the war would have lasted longer, cost more lives, demanded more suffering. They turned impossibility into infrastructure. They transformed chaos into order. They took mud, steel, and timber, the rawest of materials, and fashioned from them the architecture of victory. Many of them never came home. They lie in Commonwealth cemeteries across Belgium and the Netherlands, their headstones marked with the badge of the Royal Canadian Engineers. They are buried in the soil they helped reclaim, beside the roads they helped build, near the bridges that still bear the memory of their labour. The liberation of Europe was not won by firepower alone. It was won by logistics, by engineering, by the patient, exhausting, unglamorous work of building and rebuilding, day after day, under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. The Canadians who performed that work deserve to be remembered, not as footnotes to greater battles, but as the essential foundation upon which those battles depended. They built the road to victory, and history owes them its thanks. If this story of Canadian engineers building bridges through the mud of Europe stayed with you, please take a moment to like this video. It helps Canadian Legacy keep sharing the human side of the Second World War. Subscribe to Canadian Legacy to stay connected with these untold histories, and share this channel with someone who would care. Every view helps keep these voices alive. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for honouring the men who turned mud, steel and timber into the road to victory.